For 18 years, Sarah Coleman believed her husband abandoned them, left her alone with 3 kids, and never looked back. She told herself he was a coward, a deadbeat father who chose himself over his family. But when her oldest son turned 25 and started asking questions, when he found a box in his grandmother's attic that didn't make sense, when the pieces stopped fitting together, she discovered something that shattered everything she thought she knew. The truth wasn't that he left. The truth was that he died the day he disappeared. And someone close to her, someone she trusted, had been lying to her face for nearly 2 decades. Someone had watched her struggle, watched her children grow up believing they weren't worth staying for, and said nothing. This is the story of a mother's sacrifice, a family's unraveling, and the devastating moment when the truth finally came to light. What would you do if everything you told your children was a lie? Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now, this isn't just a story about a missing father or a woman who rebuilt her life from nothing. This is about deception that spans decades. This is about the weight of secrets and the people who carry them. This is about a family that lived their entire lives on a foundation built on lies. And the moment that foundation cracked wide open, 3 questions will drive this story forward. Where did David Coleman really go on June 14, 1999? Who knew the truth and chose silence? And what could possibly be worth 18 years of watching a family suffer? By the end of this video, you'll understand why sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who think they're protecting us. Let's go back to the beginning. 1994, Portland, Oregon. Sarah Donnelly was 22 years old, working as a nursing assistant at Providence Portland Medical Center, putting herself through school, building a life. She came from a tight-knit Irish Catholic family, the youngest of 4 daughters, raised to believe in hard work, faith, and family above everything else. She met David Coleman at her sister's engagement party, and by all accounts, it was the kind of meeting that changes everything. David was 25, working construction, had that easy confidence that comes from being good with your hands, good at fixing things. He told her that night that he was going to marry her, and she laughed, thought he was joking. 6 months later, they were standing in front of a priest at Sacred Heart Church, and Sarah was 3 months pregnant with their first child. Emma was born in March 1995, and for a while everything seemed perfect in the way that young love always does. David was a good provider, picked up overtime whenever he could, brought home flowers on Fridays, coached Little League on weekends. Sarah finished her nursing degree, got a job at the same hospital, working night shifts so one of them could always be home with Emma. They bought a small house in southeast Portland, yellow with white trim, a swing set in the backyard. The kind of house where you picture Christmas mornings and birthday parties, and a lifetime of ordinary, beautiful moments. But somewhere around 1997, things started to shift in ways that were hard to name. David became quieter, more distant. He started taking calls in the garage, stepping outside when his phone rang. He picked up more overnight jobs, sometimes disappearing for 3 or 4 days at a time, saying the crew was working on a project out in Bend or Eugene. Sarah noticed. Of course, she noticed. But she was pregnant again, this time with twins, and exhaustion has a way of making you ignore the things that require too much energy to confront. Jake and Tyler were born in January 1998, and suddenly Sarah had a 3-year-old and 2 infants, and David was working more than ever. He missed the twins' birth because he was on a job site in Salem. He missed Emma's 4th birthday because of an emergency repair in Astoria. Sarah told herself it was just the season of life, that all young families go through this, that the distance would pass. But there were moments that stuck with her, moments she would replay 1,000 times later when everything fell apart. The night she found $3,000 in cash hidden in a toolbox in the garage. David said he was saving for a surprise, a vacation maybe, didn't trust banks. The time she answered his cell phone and a woman's voice asked for him, then hung up when Sarah said who she was. David said it was a client, said construction companies sometimes hired women as project managers now. Sarah wanted to believe him, so she did. By the spring of 1999, Sarah could feel something breaking. David would come home and stare at the kids, like he was memorizing their faces. He started asking strange questions, hypotheticals that felt too heavy for casual conversation. If something happened to me, would you be okay? If I had to go away for a while, would you manage? Sarah thought he was having a midlife crisis at 29 years old, thought maybe he was feeling trapped, suffocated by responsibility. She suggested counseling. He said he'd think about it. 2 weeks later, he was gone, June 14th, 1999. It was a Monday morning, the kind of morning that feels like every other morning until it becomes the morning that changes everything. David left for work at 6:47. Sarah was in the kitchen feeding the twins their breakfast, mashed bananas and Cheerios, the everyday chaos of toddlers. Emma was watching cartoons in the living room, still in her pajamas. David kissed them all goodbye, Emma on the top of her head, the twins on their cheeks, Sarah on her forehead. He told her he loved her. She said it back. It was the last time any of them saw him. When David didn't come home that night, Sarah felt annoyed more than worried. He'd been doing this lately, coming home late without calling, offering thin explanations she didn't quite believe. She put the kids to bed, ate dinner alone, watched the 10 o'clock news, went to sleep angry. But when she woke up Tuesday morning and his fight out of bed was still empty, cold, untouched, something shifted in her chest. She called his cell phone. It went straight to voicemail. She called Morrison Construction, the company he'd been working for since '96. The foreman, a man named Chuck Henderson, said David never showed up Monday, never called in. Chuck had tried reaching him too. Sarah felt the first spike of real fear then, that animal instinct that tells you something is very wrong even before your brain catches up. She called David's brother, Robert Coleman. Robert lived in Beaverton, worked as an accountant, was 5 years older than David, and had always been the responsible one, the stable one. Robert said he hadn't heard from David in 2 weeks, asked if everything was okay. Sarah said she didn't know. She called David's parents. They hadn't heard from him either. By Wednesday afternoon, Sarah was sitting in a police station in northeast Portland, filing a missing person report with a detective named William Harris. Harris was in his 50s, had that weathered look of someone who'd seen too much, believed too little. He took down all the information, date of birth, height, weight, distinguishing marks. He asked the hard questions. Had they been fighting? Was there any history of violence? Did David have a drug problem, a gambling problem, any debts? Sarah said no to everything. She said they were fine. She said this wasn't like him. The police found David's truck on Thursday morning. It was parked near the Columbia River, off Marine Drive, in a lot near Blue Lake Park. The doors were unlocked. His wallet was in the center console. ID and credit cards are still inside. $47 in cash. His work boots were in the back. His thermos was in the cup holder, still half full of coffee, 2 days old. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no indication of what had happened. Detective Harris told Sarah they'd drag the river, check the hospitals, put out an alert. He said most people who disappear do it on purpose, that they usually turn up eventually, that she should prepare herself for the possibility that David left because he wanted to. Sarah refused to believe it. She made flyers with David's picture, his smile from their wedding day, his eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. She posted them all over Portland, on telephone poles and in coffee shops and at grocery stores. Her sisters helped. Her mother helped. They organized search parties, walked through Forest Park calling his name, checked homeless shelters and hospitals from Portland to Seattle. For 3 weeks, Sarah lived in a state of suspended disbelief, moving through the world like everything was underwater, muted and slow and unreal. She'd wake up and forget for half a second that he was gone, reach for him in bed, find empty space. The twins were too young to understand, but Emma kept asking when Daddy was coming home, and Sarah didn't know what to say. And then on July 6, 1999, Sarah received a letter. It came in a plain white envelope, no return address, postmarked from Reno, Nevada. Inside was a single piece of notebook paper, the kind with the spiral tears along one edge. The handwriting was David's, messy and slanted, the way he was wrote. The message was 7 words. Don't look for me. I'm sorry. David. Sarah read it 10 times, 20 times, 100 times. She held it up to the light, looking for hidden messages. She smelled it for traces of cologne. She showed it to Detective Harris, who said this happened more often than people think, that men get overwhelmed and run, that sometimes they come back, Sometimes they don't. Sarah wanted to keep searching. But what do you search for when the person tells you to stop looking? The police closed the case as a voluntary disappearance. David's parents held a memorial service even though there was no body, said they needed closure. Sarah refused to go. She clung to the possibility that he'd come back, that this was temporary, that he'd walk through the door one day with an explanation that would make everything make sense. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and David never came back. By the fall of 1999, Sarah had to make a choice. She could fall apart, or she could survive. She had 3 children depending on her. She chose survival. In 2001, Sarah filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment. The court declared David legally absent. Sarah went back to her maiden name Donnelly, but kept the kids as Colemans because that's who they were. That's what their birth certificates said. She worked double shifts at the hospital, picked up extra hours wherever she could. Her parents helped with childcare. Her sisters rotated dinner duty, making sure the kids had hot meals. Sarah became 2 parents in one, attending soccer games and parent-teacher conferences and piano recitals alone, always with an empty chair beside her where David should have been. The years that followed were a slow accumulation of moments that should have belonged to 2 people, but fell to Sarah alone. She was the one who taught Emma how to ride a bike, running alongside her down the sidewalk until Emma found her balance and pedaled away, glowing with pride. She was the one who sat through Jake's terrible elementary school violin recitals, clapping like he was a prodigy, even though every note made her wince. She was the one who went to Tyler's first baseball game, watched him strike out 3 times, held him while he cried in the parking lot, and told her he wanted to quit everything. She was the one who worked overnight shifts on Christmas Eve so she could afford the toys under the tree, who fell asleep at the kitchen table going through bills, who learned how to unclog drains and fix the garbage disposal and change the oil in the car because there was no one else to do it. And through all of it, Sarah had to decide what to tell her children about their father. Emma was old enough to remember him, to ask where he went and why he didn't come back. Sarah made a choice, and looking back, it was the only choice she felt she could make at the time. She told Emma that Daddy had to go away, that he made some mistakes, that sometimes adults must make choices that hurt the people they love. She never said he died, because she didn't believe he was dead, even with the silence, even with the years. She never said he abandoned them, not in those exact words, but the implication was there, hanging in the air like smoke. As Emma got older, as Jake and Tyler grew up and started asking their own questions, the story solidified into something harder, less forgiving. By the time the kids were teenagers, David Coleman had become the cautionary tale Sarah told them about responsibility and commitment. He became the reason she warned Emma about boys who made big promises. He became the specter that Tyler fought against, the voice in his head telling him he'd turn out the same way. He became the absence that shaped everything about who they were. Emma, the oldest, carried it differently than her brothers. She became fiercely protective of Sarah, defensive in a way that bordered on aggression whenever anyone asked about her father. She grew up fast, too fast, helping with the twins when Sarah was at work, learning to cook dinner at 10 years old, could become a second parent before she was old enough to understand what she was sacrificing. Emma graduated high school with honors, got a scholarship to Portland State, studied social work because she wanted to help families like hers, families held together by single mothers with too much weight on their shoulders. She rarely talked about David, and when she did, it was with a coldness that suggested the grief had frozen over into something harder to thaw. Jake, quiet and sensitive, internalized everything in the way that middle children often do. He was the one who drew pictures of their family with an empty space where his father should have been. He was the one who asked Sarah if it was his fault, if maybe Daddy left because Jake cried too much as a baby, or wasn't good enough at sports, or didn't make him proud. Sarah held him and promised him it wasn't his fault, that none of it was his fault, but Jake carried that question with him into adulthood, like a stone in his pocket. He struggled with anxiety, had panic attacks in high school, saw a therapist who tried to help him untangle the abandonment from his sense of self-worth. Tyler, the youngest by 3 minutes, went the opposite direction. He was angry in the way that boys become when they don't know how to process hurt. He acted out in school, got into fights, talked back to teachers, pushed boundaries until they broke. He was the one who said he hated David, who said good riddance, who told anyone who would listen that he didn't need a father because he never had one anyway. But Sarah knew it was armor, that underneath the rage was a child who felt rejected at a cellular level, who wondered what was so wrong with him that his own father couldn't stay. Tyler barely graduated high school, bounced between jobs, couldn't seem to find solid ground. Sarah worried about him the most, saw him spiraling in slow motion and didn't know how to stop it. The three of them grew up in the shadow of a man who wasn't there, and that absence shaped them in ways both visible and hidden. They learned not to rely on people, not to trust promises, not to believe in forever, because forever had walked out the door on a Monday morning in June and never came back. Sarah herself carried the weight in ways she never let the kids see. She didn't date for years after David disappeared, couldn't imagine letting someone else into their lives, into the fragile structure she'd built from nothing. When she finally tried, in 2008, she met a man named Tom at the hospital, a physical therapist, who was kind and patient, and seemed to understand that she came with baggage. They dated for 6 months before Sarah realized she couldn't do it, couldn't let herself be vulnerable like that again, couldn't risk her children getting attached to someone who might leave. She broke things off, told Tom it wasn't him, which was true. It was her, or more accurately, it was David, still haunting her from wherever he was, whatever he was doing, living his new life without them. Sarah went to therapy herself, tried to work through the abandonment, the betrayal, the rage that lived under her skin like a low-grade fever. Her therapist asked if she'd ever considered that David might be dead, that the letter might have been written under duress or forged entirely. Sarah said she'd thought about it, but couldn't afford to hope for that. Couldn't afford to rewrite the narrative into something that let her off the hook for hating him. The years stacked up like stones, each one marking another milestone David missed. Emma's graduation, Jake's first girlfriend, Tyler's 21st birthday. Sarah took pictures at every event, made photo albums, sent updates to David's parents, even though they'd stopped asking. She kept one picture of David in a drawer in her bedroom, looked at it sometimes when she couldn't sleep, studied his face for clues she might have missed. What had he been thinking that last morning? Had he known it was goodbye? Had he felt guilty, relieved, torn apart? She would never know, and that not knowing was its own special kind of torture. By 2024, Sarah was 52 years old. Emma was 29, working as a family counselor in Vancouver, Washington. Jake was 26, working as a graphic designer, living in a small apartment in Northeast Portland, still in therapy, still working through the layers. Tyler was also 26, working at a brewery, finally starting to find some stability, some sense of purpose. Sarah had been alone for 25 years, and she'd made peace with it, or at least she told herself she had. She'd built a life that worked, a routine that was predictable and safe. She had her kids, her granddog, her job. She had Sunday dinners where everyone came over and they pretended they were whole. It was enough. It had to be enough. And then Jake called her on a Saturday afternoon in March, and everything Sarah thought she knew began to unravel. Jake had been helping his grandmother, David's mother Margaret, clean out her attic. Margaret was 81 now, preparing to move into assisted living, and she'd asked Jake to sort through decades of accumulated belongings, boxes of old clothes, and books and forgotten memories. Jake found the box tucked in the far corner, under a stack of Christmas decorations, covered in dust. It was labeled David's Things in Margaret's shaky handwriting. Inside were the remnants of a life Jake had never known. His father's high school yearbook, pictures of David as a teenager with feathered hair and a cocky smile. His father's baseball glove from college, worn leather that still held the shape of a hand. A stack of letters David had written to Margaret from various job sites, casual updates about work and weather and life. And underneath all of that, a manila envelope that felt too official, too important to be buried in an attic. Jake opened it and found a newspaper clipping from The Oregonian dated June 17, 1999. The headline read, "Local man reported missing." It was about David. There was his picture, the same one Sarah had used on the flyers. But that wasn't what stopped Jake's breath. Underneath the clipping was another article, this one dated December 20th, 2000. The headline read, "Cold Case Files." Portland police release list of unsolved disappearances. David's name was on the list, one line among dozens, but paper clipped to that article was something that made no sense at all. A death certificate. Official, stamped, signed. Name, David Michael Coleman. Date of death, June 14, 1999. Time of death, 23:43 hours. Place of death, Providence Portland Medical Center. Cause of death, blunt force trauma, internal bleeding, multiple injuries consistent with motor vehicle accident. Jake sat on the floor of his grandmother's attic holding the paper, reading it over and over, trying to make the words say something different. His father was dead. His father had been dead since the day he disappeared. His father died 25 years ago, and nobody told them. Jake drove straight to his mother's house. Didn't call first. Just showed up on her doorstep with the envelope in his hand, and a look on his face that made Sarah's heart drop. Jake spread the papers out on Sarah's kitchen table and watched her face as she read. He watched the confusion, then the disbelief, then something harder to name that looked like grief and rage mixed together. Sarah picked up the death certificate with shaking hands, studied every detail, like she was looking for evidence of forgery. The signature at the bottom belonged to Dr. Richard Lawson, trauma surgeon at Providence, Portland, the same hospital where Sarah worked, where she'd worked that night 25 years ago. She'd been on shift when David died, and she never knew. She'd been on shift when someone, presumably family, came to identify the body, to sign papers, to take possession of his belongings. She checked the records section. Next of kin notified, Robert Coleman, relation, brother. Sarah stared at that line until the words lost meaning. Robert knew. Robert had known for 25 years. Robert, who came to her house every Thanksgiving and Christmas. Robert, who played with her children and asked about their lives. Robert, who looked her in the eye 1,000 times and said nothing. Robert, who let her believe David abandoned them. Sarah called Robert that night. He didn't answer. She called again. No answer. She drove to his house in Beaverton, Jake following in his own car because he wouldn't let her go alone. Robert's wife, Linda, answered the door, took one look at Sarah's face, and called for Robert. He came to the door looking older than 59, looking like he'd been expecting this moment for a very long time. Sarah held up the death certificate and asked him one question. Why? Robert didn't answer right away. He stood in his doorway, and for a moment Sarah thought he might deny it, might claim it was fake or a mistake or something explainable. But he didn't. He just stepped aside and let them in, and when they were all sitting in his living room, Robert Coleman did something he hadn't done in 25 years. He told the truth. David died on June 14, 1999, at 11:43 at night. Robert got the call at midnight from Providence, Portland, from the emergency department, asking him to come identify the body. Robert drove to the hospital in a fog, couldn't process what they were telling him. His little brother, dead at 29 years old. The details came out slowly, painfully. David had been driving east on Highway 26, out past Gresham, heading into the mountains. He'd been speeding, going at least 70 in a 55 zone. He lost control on a curve, crossed the center line, hit a tree head-on. The impact was catastrophic. He wasn't wearing a seatbelt. He was airlifted to Providence, Portland, but was unresponsive on arrival. The trauma team worked on him for 37 minutes before calling time of death. Robert identified the body, signed papers, answered questions, and then he saw what was in David's truck, the wreckage the police had pulled from the crash site. And everything Robert thought he knew about his brother shattered. In the truck, in a duffel bag in the back seat, police found identification documents that didn't make sense. Another driver's license, issued to David Coleman, but with a different address, a house in Beaverton. Another wedding ring, different from the one David wore with Sarah. Photographs of David with another woman, with 2 children who looked like him. Business cards for a contracting company Robert had never heard of. Cell phone bills in David's name but a different number. Bank statements for accounts Robert didn't know existed. Robert spent the next 2 days investigating what he couldn't bring himself to believe. He tracked down the address on the driver's license, drove past the house, saw the woman and 2 children through the window. He checked public records, marriage certificates, property deeds. The truth was worse than he imagined. David Coleman had been living 2 complete lives. He had 2 families, Sarah and Emma and Jake and Tyler in southeast Portland. and Jennifer Martinez and her children, Michael and Sophie, in Beaverton. 2 wives, 2 sets of children, 2 homes just 14 miles apart. Jennifer Martinez had married David Coleman in November 1992, 2 years before he married Sarah, which meant Sarah's marriage was never legal, which meant Sarah's children were born outside of marriage without her knowing it, which meant David had been committing bigamy for 5 years. Jennifer had no idea about Sarah, thought David was working construction all over the state, thought his frequent absences were just the nature of his job. Sarah had no idea about Jennifer, thought the same thing. David had managed to keep both worlds separate through careful scheduling, separate bank accounts, separate phone numbers, separate everything. Robert sat in his car outside Jennifer's house, trying to decide what to do with this information. He could tell Sarah, destroy her with the truth, that David hadn't just left, but had been lying to her from the beginning. He could tell Jennifer, destroy her world in the same way. He could blow up both families with one truth bomb. Or he could stay silent. He chose silence. Robert made a decision that night that would haunt him for 25 years. He decided that the truth would cause more damage than the lie. He decided that Sarah and her children deserved better than knowing they were the other family, that they were the mistake, that David had a first wife and first children he'd been trying to get back to. Robert went to Jennifer Martinez and told her the truth, told her about the accident, told her about Sarah. He showed her the evidence, watched her world collapse in real time. He made Jennifer an offer. He would pay her to disappear, to move away, to never contact Sarah or the children, to let them believe David had simply vanished. Jennifer had her own reasons to accept. She didn't want her children knowing their father was a bigamist. She didn't want the scandal, the judgment, the mess. Robert gave her $75,000, money from David's life insurance policy that named Jennifer as the beneficiary, and she moved to Arizona with Michael and Sophie. Then Robert wrote the letter. He practiced David's handwriting until he could mimic it perfectly. He wrote 7 words on notebook paper, words designed to make Sarah stop searching, words designed to give her a villain to hate instead of a tragedy to mourn. He drove to Reno, Nevada, mailed the letter from there so the postmark would suggest David had run away somewhere far. He came back to Portland and watched Sarah receive the letter, watched her read it, watched her heart break in a new way, and he said nothing. Over the next 25 years, Robert carried the secret like a physical weight. He watched Sarah struggle to raise 3 children alone. He watched Emma grow up too fast, watched Jake internalize the abandonment, watched Tyler rage against a father who couldn't defend himself. He watched Sarah work herself into exhaustion, watched her give up on love, watched her build a life around the absence of a man who hadn't chosen to leave. And Robert came to family dinners and Christmas mornings and birthday parties. And he smiled, and he played with the children, and he kept his mouth shut because at a certain point, he'd gone too far to turn back. Now, sitting in his living room with Sarah and staring at him, Robert tried to explain his reasoning. He said he was trying to protect them. He said, knowing about Jennifer and the other children would have been worse than thinking David abandoned them. He said he thought he was making the merciful choice, the kind choice, the choice that would allow them to move forward without the weight of betrayal. Sarah listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Robert finally stopped talking, when he finally ran out of justifications, she asked him one question. Where is she? Robert told her. Jennifer Martinez, now Jennifer Pierce, remarried, living in Scottsdale, Arizona. Her children, Michael and Sophie Coleman, now adults, 29 and 27 years old. Sarah wrote down the address, the phone number, everything Robert could give her. She stood up to leave, and Robert tried to apologize, tried to say something that would make it less awful, but Sarah cut him off. She told him that he didn't just lie to her. He stole her children's right to know their father loved them. He stole their right to grieve properly. He stole 25 years of truth because he thought he knew better than they did what they could handle. Sarah and Jake left Robert's house and sat in the car for a long time, not talking, just processing the scale of what had been taken from them. Eventually, Sarah started the engine and drove home, and when they got there, she called Emma and Tyler and told them they needed to come over, that there was something they needed to know. It took 3 hours to explain everything, to lay out the timeline, to watch her children process the fact that their father hadn't abandoned them, that he'd died trying to make things right, that they had half-siblings they never knew existed. Emma cried in a way Sarah had never seen her cry before, a grief that had been frozen for 25 years finally thawing. Jake sat silent, staring at the death certificate like it might change if he looked long enough. Tyler punched a wall, bloodied his knuckles, then collapsed on the floor and sobbed. They'd spent their entire lives hating a dead man, blaming him for choices he never made, carrying wounds that were based on lies. And now they had to grieve him for the first time. 25 years too late. 2 weeks after the truth, Sarah did something that took more courage than the previous 25 years combined. She reached out to Jennifer Pierce. The first phone call lasted 3 minutes before Jennifer hung up, overwhelmed, unable to process. The second call, 3 days later, lasted an hour. Jennifer told her side of the story, how she'd met David in '91, how they'd married and had 2 children, how she'd believed she had a normal marriage despite his frequent absences. She told Sarah about the night Robert showed up at her door, about the choice she made to protect her children from scandal, about the guilt she'd carried for taking the money and running. Jennifer said she thought about reaching out 1,000 times over the years, wondered about Sarah and the children, wondered if she'd made the right choice. Sarah asked Jennifer if she'd be willing to meet, to let their children meet, to try to build something honest out of the wreckage of David's lies. Jennifer said yes. They met on neutral ground, a park in Salem halfway between Portland and Scottsdale, where Jennifer was visiting family. Sarah brought Emma, Jake, and Tyler. Jennifer brought Michael and Sophie. For the first few minutes, they all just looked at each other. These 2 families who shared DNA but nothing else, who were strangers bound by one man's double life. Michael looked exactly like Jake, same eyes, same jawline, same way of standing with his hands in his pockets. Sophie had Emma's smile, that same slight crookedness on the left side. They were unmistakably siblings, and yet they'd lived entire lives without knowing the other existed. Emma was the first to speak. She told Michael and Sophie that she'd spent 25 years angry at their father, believing he chose to leave, believing she wasn't enough to make him stay. Michael told Emma they'd been told the same lie, that their mother had told them David ran off with another woman, that he'd abandoned them for a different family. Both families had been fed versions of the story that made them victims of David's choices. The truth was messier, more complicated, more human. They spent 4 hours in that park, sharing memories of a man who'd somehow been 2 different people. Jennifer's David was a devoted father who coached soccer and helped with homework and talked about building a life together. Sarah's David was also a devoted father in the moments he was present, but increasingly absent, increasingly torn, increasingly desperate. They pieced together a timeline and realized David had been driving himself into the ground, trying to maintain both lives, working constantly, sleeping barely, stretched so thin he was transparent. The day he died, he'd been driving to Sarah's house to tell her everything. Jennifer confirmed it. David had told her that morning he was going to come clean, that he couldn't do it anymore, that he'd rather lose everything than keep lying. He'd been planning to confess to Sarah, to face the consequences, to try to figure out how to be present for all 5 of his children, even if it meant losing both women. He never made it. The crash happened at 10:37 p.m., and David Coleman died before midnight, before he could make things right. Sarah stood in that park surrounded by her children, and the children David had with someone else, and she felt something shift inside her. For 25 years, she'd carried anger like a shield, used it to protect herself from the deeper hurt underneath. But knowing David had been coming to tell the truth, knowing he'd died trying to fix what he'd broken, that changed something fundamental. She couldn't forgive the lying, the betrayal, the years of deception, but she could see him as human now, as flawed and desperate and overwhelmed, as someone who'd made catastrophic mistakes and run out of time to fix them. Emma asked Jennifer if they could stay in touch, if maybe they could get to know each other as siblings, try to build something real. Jennifer said yes. Michael suggested they do a DNA test just to make it official, even though they all knew the truth. Tyler said he'd like that, said he'd like to know for sure. They exchanged numbers, made plans to meet again, promised to keep talking. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, and it wasn't closure, but it was something. It was the beginning of the truth. Sarah Coleman is 52 years old now, and she's learning to live in a world where David wasn't a villain and wasn't a hero, but was simply a man who made choices that hurt everyone, including himself. She's learning to let her children grieve their father properly, to acknowledge the love he had for them, despite the lies. She's learning that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who were trying to protect us from worse pain. And sometimes that protection is more damaging than the truth would have been. Robert Coleman still carries the weight of his decision, still wonders if he made the right choice, still sees the cost of his silence in Sarah's eyes every time they're in the same room. The question that remains isn't whether David Coleman was good or bad, because the answer is both neither, more complicated than labels allow. The question is whether truth always serves us better than comfortable lies, and whether the people who love us have the right to make that choice on our behalf. Was Robert right to hide the truth for 25 years? Would you want to know if everything you believed about your life was built on deception? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story made you think differently about the secrets we keep to protect the people we love, hit that subscribe button, because next week we're telling you about a woman who disappeared for 10 years and came back to find her family had moved on. And the reason she left will break your heart.